Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with my November wrap up. It feels like I literally just filmed a wrap up for September and October, but it's already the end of November, so it's time to film another one. I only read 5 books in November, which is just barely enough to warrant a wrap up for me, because if I read 4, I just don't bother filming one. But I was sick for the last couple weeks of October and the first few weeks of November, so all of my booktubing and reading and all of that kind of stuff was sort of on the back burner for not just the time when I was sick, but also when I got better and had to catch up on all the other life stuff that I fell behind on while sick. So November wasn't the greatest booktubing, reading, etc. month for me. I was a terrible host of Nonfiction November, and I only actually read 2 nonfiction books, which sucked, but I did enjoy most of the books I read this month, and I didn't have any books that I rated negatively. The first 2 books on this list were both rereads, and they were both audiobooks, which I think is very telling of the month that I had. First was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I read this book a number of years ago and really enjoyed it at the time, but I do think I missed a lot of the story. As I tend to do with Margaret Atwood books the first time I read them, I find that I get more out of them on the reread, and that was so true for The Handmaid's Tale. I gave this book 4 stars. It's a dystopian novel in which women are second-class citizens, and they're essentially used as reproduction slaves. This tells of Fred's story and her life as a handmaid, as her only role in this society is to get pregnant by one of the upper-class men. And it's such a scary and disturbing read, because it's still relevant. Like, this book was published in, I believe, the early 80s, and you can definitely tell with the references to how society was before that she's referencing, like, the 70s because of the way that feminism worked at the time and because of what was relevant in society, which is very odd because then it goes into this sort of futuristic type world. I think this book is very well done for its limited perspective because it does tell of Fred's story very exactly. She doesn't know very much about society because she's has such a small role and because she's not allowed to know much. So all we know is what she knows, and we don't get an overall view of the society and the government and how the world works the way we usually do in dystopian books. But I do think that sort of limited the story in a negative way. I didn't dislike it for that reason, but it did feel me leaving like I wanted a lot more. I wanted to know more than I was allowed in the story. And I think if it were anyone other than Margaret Atwood writing this book, that probably would have irritated me a lot more. But because it was so well done, this is just such a worthwhile read. And I do want to comment that the audiobook I listened to was narrated by Claire Danes, and normally I don't comment much on audiobooks just because I wouldn't know how to begin reviewing them. I don't critique them, I don't think about them the same way I think about the actual book itself. But I thought Claire Danes did a wonderful job. Like, if you're interested in this book and you like listening to audiobooks as a way to read the book, I would highly recommend the Claire Danes version of this audiobook because Claire Danes was absolutely wonderful. I think her narration honestly made me enjoy the book a lot more. I mean, it was still 4 stars when I read it the first time, but I just absolutely adored the way she narrated it. Next, I read Night by Elie Wiesel. This is a nonfiction account of his time in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. I also gave this book 4 stars. This was also a reread for me. I wasn't hugely fond of the audiobook for this one just because for whatever reason I struggled to keep up with the narrator and his voice, which he was doing absolutely nothing wrong. That was just a personal thing. I'm very picky when it comes to that kind of thing on audiobooks just because my reading comprehension on them is already so low. But I love this book. I think this is such a worthwhile read. I've read a lot about World War II, about Nazi Germany, and about the Holocaust. And this book captures it like no other. And not just because it's nonfiction, because I have read other nonfiction accounts, but if you want to know what it felt like, even like the smallest drop of what it felt like, I think this is a book you need to pick up. It's so terrifying and just like horrifying reading everything that happened and a personal account of what he went through. And even he says in one of his prologues or introductions that came with a later edition of the book, he says that the horror you feel in this is not even like a tenth of what it felt to actually be there. And like there are no words that could actually describe what he felt, and this book was the closest he could come to. And even this is just absolutely such a hard read, and I do think it's worth it. Like, obviously, like, not everyone would be able to read this book just because of the very difficult subject matter. There's a lot of like really horrible topics, like it's the Holocaust. I don't think I really need to go into that very much, but I think if you can, this is a book that really needs to be read. And I know a lot of people read it in school, which I think is great, but if you somehow missed out on that, like I did, I didn't read this book until after I'd left college, I think you need to pick this up. Like, I just think this is one of those great historical accounts that everyone should pick up and read at some point, if only to understand even the smallest amount of what it was like for the people who experienced it. And then I went with a little bit of a lighter read. I picked up The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. This was a buddy read with cozy reader Kelly, and I gave this book 3 stars. This is a middle grade fantasy novel about Jin, who is a thief. He is arrested and thrown in the king's prison, and then one of the king's closest advisors pulls him out of prison to go on this quest and steal this amulet. Essentially, whoever has the gift, as it's called, is the ruler who has the god's blessing, and the people will follow them. And I didn't hate this book. The story seemed like it was going to be interesting, but that was kind of the problem. I didn't get the story. I got the introduction to the story. It didn't really start getting interesting until the last couple of chapters, and I just was bored and uninterested, and there was so much time spent introducing the characters and like, this is who they are, this is what their personality is like, here they're all traveling together, and let's talk about the food they're eating and what they're doing on their travels and how Jin doesn't like to ride horses, and on, and there wasn't actually much story. This is a series. I think there are 3 more books in the series. I'm not entirely sure on that, but this definitely felt like it was setting up a story that was going to be interesting. And I kept getting that feeling like, I like this main character. I sort of like the way this world is set up. It's a Greek-inspired fantasy, which I've actually never read before. I've read fantasy that was literally Greek fantasy with the Greek gods and such, but I've never read anything that took Greek fantasy and then created a high fantasy world sort of inspired by that, with like their own gods and own countries and characters that wasn't actually Greek-based. And I do think I'll continue this series, but this book was like a necessary evil to get to what the interesting story is going to be. I think this probably could have been condensed into about the first third of the next book, probably. Like, this was unnecessarily long, which is strange to say because it's a fairly quick middle grade book, but I never wanted to pick it up. I did enjoy the ending, and I was interested to see where it was going to go next because I really did not see the ending coming at all. It really surprised me. But just overall, this felt like an incredibly boring, unnecessary introduction to a story when the introduction doesn't need to be an entire book. And then I read Emmy and Oliver by Robin Benway. This is a young adult contemporary novel that focuses on a romance between the girl Emmy and her friend Oliver. Oliver has just returned after being kidnapped at the age of 8. They're now about 18. And they're reconnecting as they're still next door neighbors as Oliver comes back into this world, not really understanding like why he left and like all the things that happened while he was gone. It focuses on the romance. It's very sweet and cute. I gave this 3 stars mostly because it was a little bit too romance heavy for me. I do like romance and I do read romance novels. This was just, I was a lot more interested on the kidnapping than I was the romance aspect. When there's sort of a serious background for romance novels, I do tend to be more interested in that background topic than the romance itself, which is always a struggle for me. And that is something that's very personal. I think if you go into this just wanting the romance aspect, you'll be very happy. I also found that it was a little bit too teenagery for me, which again is a personal thing. This is a YA novel. But I do think this is one of those YA novels that isn't going to be as well received by adults who read the young adult genre. There was just so much of the main character and all her friends complaining about their parents and all that kind of like teenagery, immature drama stuff that just got a little bit old for me, and I do kind of have a hard time reading that now, whereas at, 14 15 or 16, I probably would have appreciated that a lot more and related to it a lot more. It's just when I hear, a 17-year-old complaining about their 9 o'clock curfew on a school night, I have a hard time getting behind that. But I do think this book had a lot of good points, and there were a lot of things that I did enjoy about it. It was very quick for me to get through and very entertaining, so I do think if you go into it knowing what it is and expecting that and wanting that, you're going to enjoy it a lot more than I did, and I can absolutely see why people would love this book. And the final book I read was the only nonfiction book I had on my nonfiction November TBR that I managed to get to and finish, and that was Without You, There Is No Us by Suki Kim. This is a memoir of a teacher who went undercover at a school in North Korea. She taught the students of some of the elite of North Korea, and she was teaching them English. It was very interesting. We know so little about North Korea that even this limited perspective was so enlightening and so interesting to read. She was actually double undercover because she was pretending to be a missionary who was pretending to be a teacher because the school was run by Christian missionaries, and she's not Christian. I don't know if she ever specifically mentions that she's atheist, but that was sort of the impression I got from her. I wound up really enjoying this. This was such a quick read to get through, which kind of surprised me, but she is a journalist, and she has a very easy writing style. But I think she didn't go as deep as I would have liked. I know this is North Korea, and there was no way for her to answer all the questions that she had, but it seemed like a lot of the time she would ask these rhetorical questions, and then not only would she not answer them, which I wasn't expecting her to, and that would have been unfair to expect her to answer these questions that she literally couldn't, but she wouldn't really dig deeper into them, just in a reflective way. She would say, I want to open these boys' minds to the outside world and show them that there's more than North Korea, that the internet exists, that all these movies and books and people have choice. I want to show them that in at least some small way. But if I do, is that helping them or is that hurting them? Which is a very interesting question, I think. That's something very interesting to think about. But it would kind of stop after that. And then she'd go back into her normal routine until she'd get to a point where she'd ask that question again. And it just kind of felt like there wasn't a lot more there. I kind of would have liked a little bit more to delve deeper into what she thought and what she eventually decided, because it felt like she never really made a decision, or delve deeper into why she couldn't make up her mind. But it did feel just a little bit shallow in that regard. But overall, I found this book really worthwhile. If you're interested in North Korea, I would highly recommend this book because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it is a perspective that we don't get much as someone who's a visitor to North Korea but lived there for several months under these very strict boarding school conditions. So those were the only 5 books that I managed to finish in November, but I did start 4 other nonfiction books, which is a lot to be currently reading, but because they're nonfiction, there's a dictionary, 2 anthologies, and then I'm reading sort of a philosophical argument on abortion, which is very interesting so far. I did make it a lot of the way through Killed, Great Journalism Too Hot to Print, which was edited by David Wallace, and I'm thoroughly enjoying that book. The other 3 I haven't made quite as much progress with, but I'm hoping to finish all 4 of those in December, so it will be kind of an extended nonfiction November for me, as I didn't really get any reading done this month until about halfway through. I think I finished The Handmaid's Tale and Night, which were 2 audiobooks, before I managed to finish anything else, just because of how rough the month started out for me. But I'm doing much better now, and I am getting more into reading things, and I'm really enjoying all the nonfiction books I picked so far. Let me know what some of your favorite books of November are, and if you read any of these books that I've talked about, because I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys again soon.